The next couple of talks are going to support everything that Julie has been saying and talking about how we can do restoration without doing any harm. So we want to lift the land. We want to plant plants, oak trees, wildflowers. Don't forget about the grasslands. But how can we do this while not doing harm? So that's part of the messaging and around the next couple talks. So Diana Benner, our partner with growing many, many thousands of plants in the Park District, owner-founder of the Watershed Nursery, is going to talk to us about the role of native nurseries in preserving biodiversity.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'll start off saying, oh good, there we go, okay. Just giving a little, I've got slides now I need to make, there we go. Introduction of who I am. I'm a fourth generation Californian. We live in a state that's one of 36 biodiversity hotspots in the world. It's incredible, especially if you like plants. We've got 6,500 species of plants in California. That's about a third of all of them in Northern California, here in our state. I am also a third generation in Berkeley, and also a great place to be if you love plants. The CNPS was started inspiration at the Tilden Botanical Garden, and the East Bay Regional Parks have over 40% of the whole state's diversity within. Can you guys hear me if I stand back here? Closer? Okay. The East Bay Regional Parks have over 40% of the biodiversity of the whole state here in these lands that you all are responsible for caretaking. And so, of course, I was fell in love with plants. I live in a house that's on Cordonices Creek that my grandfather built. And when my father was growing up, there was covey of quail all over the place in the oak grasslands. Now it is mostly ivy, redwoods, domestic cats. So my family's experienced firsthand how radically a habitat can change over a pretty short amount of time. We're also third generation Sierra Club, so even though my grandfather did participate in some of that ivy and redwood planting, I think, we also grew up really honoring nature, treasuring the opportunity to be out in nature, which included playing in the East Bay Regional Parks as a child. So all that inspired me to become a vegetation ecologist and to establish the Watershed Nursery, which we established back in 2001, with a restoration focus. That's what we wanted to do. I co-founded with a friend of mine, and we wanted to grow plants for local restoration projects, based it on the principles of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area Nurseries, and those principles are focused on biodiversity, preserving biodiversity, and genetic diversity. And in the history with the nursery, we've had so much fortune of getting to participate in various East Bay Regional Park District projects. And in those projects, gotten to explore even more than as a kid I did, the diversity, the amazing pockets that you come across while you're exploring in the parks that are just, as a botanist, all the caterpillars are cool too, but as a botanist, you're just like, I can't believe this is here still. So very exciting. The things I want to talk with you about today is sort of what makes a restoration nursery. What are the things that we think about that other nurseries might not be thinking about? I do want to talk about a specific East Bay Regional Park project that we got to participating in. You know about threats, but I just want to emphasize a few things that we're thinking about as a restoration nursery, and then emphasize, everything that's been talked about today, but the importance of collaboration. It's a lot, and I think that bringing in the community and the volunteers and all that is going to be a critical component moving forward. So it might seem like a simple question, what's a native plant? Because in restoration we're planting native plants, but that top definition from the California Native Plant Society is on a temporal scale and does not necessarily mean what's going to be appropriate for a project that we're doing here. The two images below are from the Jepson Manual, which is like the Bible for botanists. And even though both of those plants are native, clearly the Heckellia wouldn't be something that would be appropriate for a project up here. Something else that we consider not appropriate for restoration projects are cultivars and hybrids. These can be native plants, but they're native plants that have been selected for a certain flower color or leaf shape or growth habit. And what that means is that once they've been identified and selected for that reason, the goal is to keep those traits, which means that you propagate them vegetatively. You do cuttings or tissue culture, but every single plant of that plant is genetically the same plant, which is the stark contrast of what we want in restoration. I can't get quite the right distance. Is it okay? Okay. And I just love that example that Julia was talking about with the oaks, right? That they're finding oaks within that habitat that are showing more resistance. So that's what we want when we're doing restoration, is to have a very healthy amount of genetic diversity so that the genetic diversity exists to respond to changing conditions. So that tells us a few things of what we don't want to use as our definition. When we started the nursery, sorry about that, that's interesting. Really the focus guiding us now is that watershed, again, as Julia was talking about, like getting the genetics from where your project is. And this is really guided by the principles of you have the genetics that are adapted to that site, right? You have the populations that have been living in that area, dealing with the adaptive factors that have been selecting on their genes, so they're going to have the optimal survival when you outplant them. Makes good sense. Also, if you have populations of that same species in the area, if you bring in genetics from somewhere else, you may end up diluting the adaptations of the populations that are there and doing a detriment to the existing populations. So both of those principles really make good sense. And we all know that things have changed, right? I mean, the amount of wildlife, the movement of wildlife, all of that over what was here historically has changed dramatically. So the flow of propagule material, gene flow, has been impeded in that way. We've got cement corridors and driveways and houses and buildings. So the flow of genes has been altered from what it was historically. And so we ideally would have something, and plants can be compromised also by being too isolated. So ideally what we would know is what's the pollination and dispersal mechanism of every plant that we're looking at. And then we can see, like, if it's wind dispersed, probably more gene mixing than something that's ant dispersed. And it might be more important to have an ant dispersed population be very local than a wind dispersed. It's amazing how little we know about that. There's a lot of plants. There's 6,500 species, so we don't know that information for all of them. So we use the guidance of Watershed Specific with factoring in the information we do have. So just to sort of reiterate difference between a restoration and ornamental nursery, we're thinking about how local, like what is native actually can be completely different in those two contexts. Propagating differently, so not doing sexual growing from seed ideally for getting all that genetic diversity. Different outplanting circumstances. Anybody who's been to our nursery knows that we have these sort of funny containers that are not standard in the ornamental industry because you're often outplanting where there's not irrigation all the time. So you're going for real healthy root tissue ratio. Instead of getting a 1 gal roots like this and the tree is that tall, and I feel so bad for those guys. And as we mentioned, all of this related to different propagule source. We're in our propagules, we're striving for seed. We do 98% of our propagation from seed. And the principle of the collection protocols, which are based on restoration principles of optimizing your genetic diversity and minimizing your impact on existing populations. And of course, a really important component of that is permission from the managers of where you're going to collect, because those land managers are going to know where other collection has happened, where there might be, have been a fire road cutting or a restoration project in the past, so it'd be different genetics of that potentially. And I think that, well, it's important that land managers are aware of what collection is happening on their properties. The rest of these protocols, I think, are pretty straightforward. You're just wanting to minimize your impact and maximize your diversity. One of the two last ones in regards to the number of populations. So when we started the nursery, it was like shooting for 10, now it's 50, and collecting on 3 different collecting times. Not every client is interested in paying us for the amount of time that takes to do that. But luckily, species are, if you have a nice diverse palette, you're out collecting multiple times, so then you can capture the sort of early fruiting genetics, mid-fruiting, like that. Oh, well, anyway, things have moved around for some reason, but that's okay. Production timeline, of course, is incredibly important for us. If we get a request for something for snowberry in the fall, well, snowberry fruits in the fall, so if we don't happen to have berries, seeds from that area, we're gonna have to wait a fall to get the seed and grow them. Grasses can be pretty fast. Pickleweed germinates fine, but it is very pooky once it starts growing, so we need time for that. Some things like tules, Schonaplectus, sometimes 6 to 8 months of treatment before you can even sow them, and then they go. So, and then of course the target container size that people want, stubbies versus big oak trees pots, which don't work well. I agree with Julia. Acorns are the best. So 2 years is super nice lead time for us. And one project that's been very nice to work with, that's given us nice lead time, is the East Bay Regional Park Landscape Project. This is a cool project. We have not had a land manager that we've worked with in the 11 counties that we've worked with who has been doing this. And it's basically working with park rangers, with Dina's input and Michelle Hammond, district botanist, in developing species lists for parks that are basically applying the restoration principles that you'd use for material for a restoration project to landscape material. So really carrying through with that mission of protecting resources to the landscaping material as well. And there's a lot of really cool things about that, but the main for me is like the potential for increased outreach to the public. Because I really think in what we've been talking about, there's a responsibility for stewardship that you all have taken on in your work. And if it's not expanding further and further with volunteers and more public outreach, it's going to feel overwhelming and daunting. And I think that this opportunity for education to the public is amazing. So with this project, it's possible to talk to folks about, landscaping with site-specific natives, for all the things Doug was talking about. There are really differential resource availability of natives versus non-natives, plus enhanced survival because it's adapted for the site, plus you're protecting existing populations, so protecting the genetics of things that are already there. And then I think, the point of assisted migration has come up, and what are we going to do in light of climate change? What's the right thing to do? I'm on the same page with Doug in that we at the nursery have always felt like these systems are very complicated. We don't understand how they are working. Our efforts are trying to proceed in a way to do no harm. And to do that, we've decided if we can contribute to local entities helping to establish healthy, robust populations that can then adapt and disperse, that's our philosophy of addressing climate change rather than making decisions about who gets moved where, with the knowledge we have right now. In addition to all these benefits and that ability for that outreach, I do think it's important to talk, to educate around threats to our local biodiversity, which is incredible. This is something near and dear to my heart for a couple of reasons. We have several projects that are solely inspired by the fact that non-native congeners, so the same genus, have been introduced and have ended up hybridizing with our native to the point that entities were afraid that we were going to lose the native species. And this has, and that terrifying aspect. I don't want anything that we do to contribute something like that. And then also it's impacting, like now when a client asks us to collect grape, well, it's very difficult for me to go out and collect a native grape and be sure that I'm getting a native grape because of all the cultivated grapes. So I'm especially worried about this in regards to the non-native oak species that, as Doug mentioned, people are talking about moving up from warmer climes around the Mexico border, even in, street planting. Not that you guys would be doing that, but out in street planting, that hybridization, wind pollinated oaks, and oaks are notorious for being promiscuous. So it just terrifies me, the thought of like, are we going to introduce something and lose these amazing oaks and all these co-evolved species? And so do no harm, try. Another threat that's out there that we're all familiar with, invasive species, and I just wanted to touch on this. I know it can be really overwhelming, and to the point where, like the annual European grasses in many places, it's really easy to say, well, it's here. I mean, many people say it's naturalized. We're not going to put resources into that, and I think that makes sense in a lot of places. And still, there's little spots in the East Bay Regional Parks when you walk around and you come on these pockets of these historic grasslands, and it does make me get all choked up. And it gives you sort of a window, right, to what was here, and it's inspiring to keep going. So keep going. Another threat that's out there that I want to talk about is pathogens. It is an invasive species. Chestnut blight on the East Coast wiped out a complete habitat type. I mean, it's just like sort of staggering in my brain to think of how huge that change was. Potato blight is something that people coming to the parks might have heard about, and that was a Phytophthora species. Affected humans really immediately. And part of the reason why that was such a disaster is because of the lack of diversity of the potato crop. Actually had been propagated vegetatively, and it had no diversity to adapt to that pathogen influence. Phytophthora ramorum, has killed millions of trees. And then pretty close by to home here, the impact of Phytophthora cinnamomi on the pallid manzanita endangered species, which there's multiple examples of pathogens with endangered species threats. And I just want to point out, none of these introductions had anything to do with the restoration project. So this is what I'm talking about in regards to outreach and education, because these pathogens, aerially dispersed pathogens, very hard to control. But these ones, these root pathogens, it's water, soil, and plants. We can control those. There are best management practices to help control, and not just control, but actually exclude these pathogens. So I just want to encourage everybody, you and your friends and family, when you visit nurseries, to just start the conversation, asking them about, do you have any best management practices in place for controlling pathogens? Because I think the more that nurseries start hearing that question from the public, the more motivated they're going to be to start implementing them. They're going to see, our public is going to be demanding these or going somewhere else that has them if we don't do it. So please do that. So I really just want to applaud the East Bay Regional Parks for the stewardship that's being taken in the parks. How many of these threats and issues that we've talked about are being addressed? Protecting resources within the park, expanding the park. Since I was a kid, there's way more, and I'm hearing about more parks being created, and creating those corridors for the populations that you're helping to make healthy and robust to be able to disperse, and addressing genetic and pathogen concerns, and having that opportunity to outreach to the community. And I just wanted to really emphasize that I feel like it's this community outreach and enlisting volunteers that is incredibly critical. And we at the nursery do talk to, when people come in to buy plants, we ask them, where do you live? Are you on the border of an East Bay Regional Park? If you're on a border, you have extra responsibility in what you're outplanting there. So trying to support all of your efforts and not have someone plant more broom on the corner. And just say that we're incredibly honored every time that we have the chance to support the goals of the East Bay Regional Parks. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk today, and I'm really grateful to all of you for the amazing work that you do. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, for all that you do.